This is the scariest ghost story ever. A story so terrifying that it inspired one of the most successful horror movies of all time, The Conjuring 2. It's the story of the Enfield Poltergeist. It was 1977, and a small house in North London was about to become the epicenter of one of the most terrifying hauntings in modern history. Inside, a single mother of four, Peggy Hodgson, was trying to make the best out of a difficult situation. She had recently split up with her husband, and she and her children were now alone. The house was cold, the food was scarce, and life was difficult. But despite everything, Peggy was doing her best for her kids. And deep down, she knew they'd eventually get through this rough patch. But then strange things started to happen. At first, it was just little noises, knocks on the wall, doors creaking open, and furniture shifting slightly. At first, both she and her children thought nothing of it. But very soon, the activity grew too strong to ignore. Then one night, while the kids were sleeping, the shaking started. Peggy's youngest daughter, Janet, just 11 years old, was pulled from her bed and thrown across the room. She landed with a sickening thud, but she wasn't hurt. In fact, she didn't even seem scared. As Peggy rushed to her side, she noticed that Janet's eyes were wide open, staring blankly ahead. She didn't respond when Peggy spoke to her, and she didn't cry out or even flinch when Peggy cradled her. It was as if something had taken over her young mind. That same night, Janet's older sister, Margaret, 13, was also pulled from her bed and thrown across the room. Peggy watched in disbelief as the bedclothes flew through the air and landed on her other two children. Who could have done such a thing? Was it some sick prank by one of the older kids? Maybe an intruder? Peggy thought of calling the police, but what would she tell them? That her children had been thrown across the room by an invisible force. They wouldn't believe her. And even if they did, how could they possibly catch whoever was responsible? Over the next few weeks, the attacks continued. Every night, the Hodgson children were pulled from their beds, thrown across the room, and watched as heavy furniture slid by itself. Sometimes the shakings happened during the day. While Peggy was at work, the children were home alone, forced to fend for themselves against whatever entity was haunting them. The entity also seemed to have a particular fondness for toys, which it would hurl through the air like deadly projectiles. Most of the time, the entity only targeted the two younger girls, but there were times when it turned its malevolent attention to the boys, Billy, just 9 years old, and Johnny, 8. One evening, Peggy was in the kitchen with her 4 children when a cup flew off the shelf and crashed to the floor. Not one to panic, Peggy told her children to go clean up the mess while she called the police. When the officers arrived, they found a heavy table had also crashed to the floor. The 4 Hodgsons stood by the table, their faces pale with fear, as the officers examined the scene. But before long, the officers were also frightened. One policewoman even wrote in her official report that she saw a chair slide across the floor on its own. Whatever was happening here could no longer be denied. The Hodgson family needed help, but where could they turn? They couldn't afford to hire private security to protect them from the ghost, and the police were clearly unable to help. So the family called in paranormal investigators, but they were in for a shock. The first investigator they called told them to pack up and leave immediately. He claimed the house was a death trap, and they would be lucky to escape with their lives. Others claimed the entity was far too powerful for them to handle and urged the family to abandon their home. None of the investigators stayed long enough to gather any real evidence, and those who did claim the presence of a ghost refused to return. Determined to help her children, Peggy didn't pack up and leave. Instead, she contacted the press. Soon, reporters, photographers, and investigators from around the world descended on the small London house. The media coverage brought unwanted attention to the Hodgsons, but it also brought hope. Finally, someone was taking their story seriously. Among the investigators was a married couple, Ed and Lorraine Warren, who believed this was not only a poltergeist, but also a demonic possession. They worked together to record the haunting. Lorraine was a seer who could see and speak to spirits, while Ed used scientific equipment to detect the presence of ghosts. On November 1977, Lorraine visited the house for the first time. She was immediately struck by the intense energy as soon as she walked through the front door. Once inside, Lorraine went straight to the bedroom where the girls slept. As she looked around the room, she felt a cold spot on the left side of the bed. She told the family to move the bed and lay down a plancher. A plancher is a flat board used in seances that can be moved by spirits. Moments later, Lorraine was pushed across the room. Shaking, she watched as the plancher spelled out a message. Beware. As the investigation continued, strange recordings were made, voices, knocks, and unexplained movements. The Warrens were able to capture the ghostly activity on tape, which they later played back for the world. By December 1977, the activity was growing worse. Night after night, the terror grew. Janet spoke in a deep, harsh voice that did not sound like her. The knocks on the wall grew louder, objects moved in front of witnesses, and the family was living in constant fear. By January 1978, the Hodgson family was desperate for help. They'd been tormented by the ghost for 6 long months, and no one was coming to their rescue. That's when they contacted the Daily Mail newspaper and invited reporters and photographers to document the haunting. On March 1978, the Daily Mail published the first story of the Enfield Poltergeist. Overnight, the Hodgson family became famous. Suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of the action. Ghost hunters, religious leaders, skeptics, and the plain curious all showed up at the house, eager to witness the haunting for themselves. Among them were Guy Playfair and his wife, who were skeptical of the haunting. Despite being skeptical, they agreed to spend the night in the house to investigate. During their investigation, they witnessed incredible activity. They saw books fly across the room, tables overturned, and chairs slide across the floor. They also heard disembodied voices, including one that said, "Get out, you dirty." After spending the night, Guy and his wife were convinced the house was haunted. They returned home and wrote a story about their experience, which was published in Reader's Digest. The story caused a sensation, and soon the Warrens were called in once again. Now Lorraine was even more convinced that the house was haunted by a demon. She claimed the entity was using Janet as a vessel and was planning to possess her. To stop the haunting, Lorraine and Ed performed an exorcism, but it didn't work. The haunting continued and grew worse. During the exorcism, one of the investigators was knocked unconscious, and another was bitten on the hand. Lorraine later claimed the demon had revealed itself to her, and she was able to identify it. It was the spirit of a former resident who had died in the house under mysterious circumstances. With the help of Father Albert Hughes, the Warrens and the Hodgsons planned to trap the ghost in a box and cast it out of the house. On July 10, 1979, the day of the ritual, the ghost was restless. Objects flew through the air, windows were smashed, and the girls were thrown across the room. Just as the ghost was about to be trapped, it grabbed Janet and threw her across the room. The family was stunned. They watched in disbelief as Janet levitated above the bed and her body twisted in unnatural ways. She spoke in voices of men who claimed to be dead. One of the investigators, Richard Morris, managed to snap a photograph of the terrifying scene. The photograph would later be featured in Reader's Digest and became known as the ghost box photograph. In the end, the exorcism failed, and the ghost remained in the house. Over the next year, the haunting gradually faded away. Some claimed it was a hoax, but many witnessed the terrifying activity firsthand. Janet later admitted that sometimes she faked small events, but insisted most of it was real and far too terrifying to explain. Today, the Enfield Poltergeist remains one of the most chilling cases ever recorded. Was it trickery or something truly demonic? The truth may never be known. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching. See you soon.